Story 1. I am not sure whether this was considered progressive when it was rolled out more than a decade ago, but the zero-tolerance policy regarding bullying is essentially a victim-blaming tool. It punishes both parties equally, even when one is likely the victim. It also encourages the victim to respond in kind, reasoning that they will be punished regardless and therefore might as well defend themselves. This sounds like a good policy, but in practice it helps no one because the actual bully faces no real repercussions and can drag an innocent student down with them. Story 2. The effort to eliminate advanced academic tracks in schools in the name of equity often holds back gifted students and deprives high-potential, underprivileged students of a crucial path to advancement. Story 3. Demanding purity and leaving no room for change is not constructive. It is not progressive to hold someone accountable only for their worst moment. It is more responsible to reward improvement and judge people by their journey away from those moments. I acknowledge that some harms are very hard to recover from. Too often, the progressive mindset fixates on mistakes instead of fostering a healthier discourse that encourages positive change. Story 4. Anti-gentrification efforts. Instead of focusing on affordability or displacement, they aim to keep neighborhoods in poor condition so they are unattractive to outsiders. Safer streets, parks, new businesses, more housing. No. Story 5. I may be thinking small, but vegan leather is much worse for the environment than animal leather. Vegan leather is essentially plastic. It wears out and stops looking and functioning well after a few months. It never biodegrades, and because it is plastic, it creates more pollution at every stage of its life cycle. Real leather lasts for years if properly maintained, is an infinitely renewable resource, and will biodegrade if not maintained. I do not have an issue with choosing to be vegan or choosing not to use leather products. Polyurethane leather was not made for vegans. It was made for consumerism because it is cheap and easy to mass produce, then rebranded as vegan leather as a marketing strategy. My comment is not about veganism, vegan ideology, or a vegan lifestyle. It is about underhanded marketing strategies and a product that is harmful to the environment. I do not care whether someone uses leather. I care that people should stop buying polyurethane leather. I am not talking about plant-based leather alternatives. Those better alternatives are usually marketed as what they actually are. If you make something with real quality, you advertise that quality. If you make something low quality, you use vague marketing jargon to make it seem better than it is. Story 6. Nuclear energy may be considered bad under this idea. It is safer and emits less radiation than coal power plants. Story 7. Natural health and alternative medicine. Posting about big pharma does not mean plant water and essential oils cure cancer. Many people have died because they believed alternative medicine would cure them. Story 8. I am surprised how many progressives have championed a universal job guarantee, since, in practice, it is just adding a work requirement to unemployment benefits under a different name. Story 9. Pacifism that treats the victim the same as the aggressor is problematic. It is reasonable to say that the United States should not have invaded Iraq in 2003 for bogus reasons, but when pacifists object to Ukraine fighting back against a Russian invasion by insisting that violence is never the answer, they are effectively saying that Ukraine should roll over and allow Russia to kill people at will. This is similar to zero-tolerance policies in schools that punish victims for defending themselves against bullies as harshly as the bullies are punished for initiating the attack. There are also tankies on the left who outright endorse aggressors such as Russia. Those pacifists would never tell a woman to lie down and let a rapist assault her, yet they do not recognize that they are applying the same logic to geopolitics. Story 10. In the United Kingdom, the justice system was incredibly lenient on violent offenders. Many offenders released under the early release scheme reoffended within weeks. Story 11. Watering down words. Unhoused, Una live. Everything so sanitized to maximize listeners' comfort and shield them from thinking about it for 5 seconds. Story 12. Policing speech involves demanding that people use the so-called correct terminology du jour instead of listening to what they are actually saying. It expects everyone to keep up with the latest euphemisms and excoriates people who use terms that were normal, neutral, or inoffensive when they were growing up. I am fine with saying the elderly instead of the ambiguous older adults. The phrase enslaved people means the same thing as slaves. The phrase people who are visually impaired has far more syllables and covers a wider range of meaning than the blind. Story 13. A lot of environmental review requirements do nothing to protect the environment. They obstruct public projects and increase urban blight by leaving lots fallow that need development. In principle, environmental reviews are good, but in places like Seattle, reactionary moderates and not in my backyard opponents have used them as a tool to prevent vital projects and to hamper the development of light rail. I have also come to believe that opposition to nuclear energy is one of the worst obstacles to addressing climate change. People are celebrating as coal plants come back online. That is utter insanity. Nuclear energy carries risk, but it may be worth it. People are not doing a cost-benefit analysis and are instead reacting to fear generated by high-profile incidents that are largely driven by human error. I also think many progressives focus their energy on pop culture squabbles rather than on organized activism, and in some cases have contributed to hundreds or even thousands of cyberbullying-related suicides in the pursuit of so-called justice across the media. There is too much emphasis on representation rather than on content, which many outside the bubble see as shallow. Many people embraced rainbow capitalism and are now surprised that corporations have shifted right. If they had been less shallow politically, they might have seen it coming. Story 14. As a fairly progressive trans man, the first thing that comes to mind is that if you behave in a way that is counterstereotypical for your sex, you must be trans. Story 15. I say this as a person of color. The whole "it's not racism if a person of color does it" or misandry only exists because of misogyny worldview misses the point. I want to call out well-intentioned, so-called leftists who promote cultural segregation by applying the concept of cultural appropriation to a college student who likes dreadlocks instead of to actual perpetrators of intellectual theft. They do not distinguish between a white man who wanted to be Baracus for Halloween and wealthy Hollywood actors who mocked black people and were handsomely paid for it. This kind of policing lacks nuance, context, and strategy. It can alienate allies or even set a movement back. How do we decide who is allowed to wear dreadlocks or dress as Baracus? My father was black and my mother white, so I am half black. My father had some white ancestry. How do we treat people with mixed or varied black heritage? For example, black people from South Asia versus black people from Africa. Trying to define cultural ownership by strict ethnic lines is itself problematic. The same pattern repeats. Wanting to do good does not guarantee you are doing good. Extremism can strategically harm a cause or be morally flawed. Being rightfully angry does not make acting out that anger an act of justice. Story 16. The idea that no one should be offended and that certain people have a right to comfort in public spaces is regressive. The only way to achieve that would be to implement fascism or to have a homogeneous society. In a melting pot society like the United States, where people come from many different races, ethnicities, religions, sexual orientations, and so on, what one person finds offensive may be acceptable to another. Therefore, policing offense must be done on a case-by-case basis. Story 17. I was listening to National Public Radio today. It said that states that adopted no-fault auto insurance, in which your own insurance pays your medical bills even if the other driver caused the accident, saw everyone's insurance rates rise. Story 18. Refusing to show up and vote for a better candidate because they are not perfect. Story 19. This may be controversial. I would like to say I am open and believe people should have freedom of religion. However, some cultures and religions have belief systems that are steeped in discrimination and hate. Story 20. The whole idea of cultural appropriation makes no sense to me. I am a center-left progressive. We learn about one another by appreciating cultures from around the world. Restricting someone from engaging with a culture solely because they are not from it halts that learning and appreciation, in my opinion. For example, people get upset at tourists for renting and wearing a kimono or yukata in Japan. People have the right to be angry only when someone intentionally uses aspects of a culture to mock its members or to express racism. Story 21. Some people oppose constructing luxury apartments. In housing economics, there is a concept called filtering. When new apartments are built, tenants move into them and leave older units vacant. Those older apartments cannot command the same rents as the newer luxury units. As housing supply increases, competition rises and older units must lower their prices. Boston's real estate market is a real-life example. Therefore, building more luxury apartments can lead to lower rents. This principle applies to housing in general. Story 22. A common belief in queer spaces is that sexuality is fluid and no one is 100% straight or 100% gay. Excluding the opposite sex from your dating pool is closed-minded. I am a lesbian. I will never be attracted to a man. I am exclusively attracted to women. Edit. Stop arguing about my sexual boundaries or I am blocking you. Story 23. Debt racking in education has been a prominent issue affecting us in real time. I saw headlines recently about Mamdani eliminating gifted programs in New York for kindergarten through third grade. The endgame happened for a while and was then somewhat undone in places like San Francisco, where algebra was not allowed to be taught until ninth grade even though everyone is required to take it. It turns out families with the means simply pull their children from public school and send them to private school. Students whose families do not have those means end up hitting a ceiling through no fault of their own. Children who were already struggling in math cannot pass because they are not ready for algebra at that point. Because funding is allocated on a per-pupil basis, shortages have resulted in cuts to extracurricular activities. I wonder whether progressive ideals ever mattered, because as part of a strategy to make up for budget shortfalls, the district is closing a Title I school. It is certainly whiplash-inducing. Whether the goal is to help low-income families or to harm them, the outcome seems harmful for those families. Story 24. Almost every major environmental organization today is working to destroy the environment. This is because they reflexively oppose any new build-out whatsoever, including new green energy sources. For example, the Sierra Club helped block what would have been the largest solar farm in the United States because the patch of desert it would have been built on is the habitat of some tortoises. This is not an isolated incident. Any new development that helps the environment, such as green energy, transmission infrastructure, and denser housing, is consistently opposed by environmental groups. The only solution to climate change they support is a kind of pastoralist to technologification in which energy consumption drops dramatically, and if you worry about the implications on living standards, fuck you for caring more about your iPhones than Mother Earth. The idea that green energy and technology can actually solve this problem without a moral reckoning being brought down on humanity for our sins is offensive to them. If you don't know anything about them, this sounds like an insane caricature from a brain cooked by Fox News. But it isn't. A large number of prominent green activists have actually been driven out of these organizations because they don't agree with the almost vengeful attitude that has become dominant. Story 25. Have you ever heard of the horseshoe theory? Essentially, when both sides become extremely radical, they loop around and become the same. When I was working as a tutor, I was told not to use big words around black students because they did not have the same education I did. So do not go too far off the deep end. Story 26. The prohibition of alcohol was considered progressive at the time. Story 27. Making people pass a test in order to vote. I hear so many progressives saying we should test people on various things before we let them vote, in the name of keeping uninformed, brainwashed supporters of Make America Great Again out of elections. Every time I bring up Jim Crow laws, they suddenly become silent, not even acknowledging that they were advocating for the same thing. Also, waving anyone south of the Mason-Dixon line away as racist and white supremacist and saying they deserve to suffer from natural disasters is common. I beg you to look at a map of racial demographics in the United States, and then look at a map showing where the most impoverished people in the United States live. Sit with that for a moment. Story 28. Less common is providing income or loans to dictatorships under the promise that they will become more democratic. Studies show this does not happen. Dictatorships that continue to receive funds or have their loan limits extended tend to spend selfishly up to the limit and will not change their behavior unless forced to do so. That typically occurs when they lose access to sufficient funds to finance the regime's wasteful spending, which can trigger either regime change or a shift toward actual democracy. Story 29. Personal carbon footprint is regressive because it shifts attention away from the fact that 70% of emissions come from 100 companies. It was introduced as a marketing exercise by British Petroleum for the same reason. Story 30. Lowering entry standards for certain underserved minority groups while keeping them the same for others only reinforces the factors that cause those groups to underperform. It addresses symptoms rather than root causes and creates a secondary effect of anger among groups not receiving special treatment when they learn of it. Story 31. Rent control causes the costs of uncontrolled housing to skyrocket and strongly incentivizes people in rent-controlled units not to move, even when they earn significantly more money. It also makes it much more difficult for people to move into a city. The only reliable way to make housing more affordable is to increase the supply of housing. Story 32. Not calling out blatant racism is unacceptable. Racists perform mental gymnastics, claiming racism is only about power and that bias is different. Treating someone negatively because of their race is racism. Treating someone negatively because of their sex is sexism. Stop enabling manipulative racists. Many people today are too spineless to call this out. Story 33. Compassion only works with accountability. Without it, it is just enabling. Story 34. Capitalizing Black and other racial groups but not white in journalism, as the Associated Press does. Either capitalize all racial groups, which I agree with, or do not capitalize any of them. Story 35. That's the funny thing about progress, even more so in science. If an idea turns out to be bad or wrong, you change direction and update the science. Progress is a cycle of trying, learning, and pivoting. Story 36. Infantilizing certain racial or demographic groups by assuming they cannot succeed or perform basic tasks without help. Story 37. In anthropology, you are encouraged to let go of your own values and embrace all cultures as valid. That is not acceptable when the culture in question physically abuses women and treats children as playthings. Story 38. Rent control is, according to introductory economics, associated with a net increase in rents overall and is a net negative for renters as a group. However, on an individual political level, it can allow someone to remain in an apartment for 40 years paying far below market rent. Imagine a balloon being squeezed, except the unpinched part receives extra air and expands for everyone else. It is not a wash for renters the way it would be in a closed system like a sealed balloon with no additional air. Story 39. Term limits on Congress. I hate the geriatric retirement home that the legislative branch has become. However, there is too much money in politics, and until that is addressed, term limits are a terrible idea. What will happen is that every few years corporate puppets will appear during each term limit cycle. Meanwhile, those who care and try to serve their communities will be forced out even if they do not deserve it. Story 40. Lengthy school closures during coronavirus disease 2019 were an absolute disaster for the underprivileged. Wealthier students continued learning remotely while many poor children left the education system, despite evidence that the risk to children was quite low and lower than many other causes of death. Story 41. The idea of creating safe spaces for people of certain races or ethnicities kind of feels like we are going back to segregation. You are missing my point. I said basing these spaces on race or ethnicity, not political viewpoints. Every political viewpoint is represented somewhere in every race. You can restrict membership in certain spaces to people of the same race or ethnicity as you, but that does not mean they will all share your viewpoints. In other words, you are restricting these spaces to people who look like you, not who think like you. Is that not segregation? Story 42. As someone who strongly supports diversity in the workplace, diversity hiring instead of equal opportunity hiring becomes regressive quickly. If there are not many people of a particular demographic in the field, then unless the pool of qualified applicants is as diverse as the general population, aiming to hire diverse candidates rather than being equally open to all candidates will deplete the pool of diverse applicants. Then companies will cast a wider net to find the remaining diverse candidates and may hire less qualified people. You will end up with less diverse workforces outside competitive hiring locations and foster resentment, because unqualified workers will make up an outsized portion of that demographic. If you want workplace diversity, conduct equal opportunity hiring and work hard to ensure each demographic has the support and encouragement needed to create a larger pool of qualified workers. That approach works, but it takes longer, so people do not like it. Accept that cultural factors mean that even with opportunity and encouragement, Not all groups will enter all fields at the same rate. We must help people envision themselves in any role. Representation is important. But you cannot force it when people from different cultures make different choices. Story 43. I've been scrolling and didn't see this, and I don't expect it to be popular, but it feels connected to me. This is also a very sensitive topic, so I apologize if I don't convey the message well. 1. Islamophilia. I know there are wonderful Muslim men and women. First-generation immigrants aren't defined only by their religion. They also live with their culture, even in a new country. It takes time to embrace a new culture, and some families won't do that for at least a generation, maybe two. I call Islamophilia a problem because the ideal makes sense, but it is often a reactionary and immature response to Islamophobia. Many progressives outright ignore or minimize issues and views in the stance against Islamophobia. For example, some LGBTQ+ individuals who insist on promoting Islam in Palestine in pride marches. I do not know of any Islamic sect that is tolerant of homosexuality in the same way some other religions are, can create tensions. There is the well-known example of progressives cheering when a town elected a Muslim majority to local government, only to be upset when that majority removed the pride flag. There was a case in my city of a Muslim man who created a network aimed at changing views on Islam and advancing progressivism, until he beheaded his wife in an honor killing, reportedly because she had an affair. 2. Israel. This is a touchy subject, but there is a lot of anti-Semitism circulating, and when you are told about it, you sometimes defend it. Criticism of Israel can slide into anti-Semitism very easily. I hate Netanyahu. I hate his government. But the reality of the situation in the region is not simply a one-state solution or magically making Palestine a regional power overnight. The solutions I hear from some progressives ignore the history of the region, make it black and white, and are extremely shallow. If progressives got everything they want, as I have heard their plans described, you could be looking at a Jewish genocide. Without a doubt, surrounding Muslim countries would take advantage of a weakened Israel and attack, as some have wanted since modern Israel was founded. Palestinians may not want to coexist with Jewish Israelis, even without Hamas. The surrounding countries would likely ignore the Palestinians as they attempt to govern, since the reality is many do not prioritize Palestinian welfare. If that happens, it will not be good. Progressives worldwide will cheer and cry that Israel has been toppled and real progress can happen, in their imagination. Then destabilization and bloodshed will follow, and the cheering will stop. Some vocal individuals will try to defend themselves, saying, "Not like this." But many will not admit they were wrong. The majority will go quiet and try to ignore the new issues. They may be ashamed, but will choose to ignore the consequences of what they were advocating. This sort of thing has happened before. It won't be new. Currently, there is no realistic way for Jews to live in Israel under a government that is not a Jewish majority. Historically, Jews have rarely been able to live with confidence and without worry in Christian or Muslim societies. If there comes a time when there isn't a Jewish majority in Israeli government, especially if that change is forced, it could mean the end of Jewish life in Israel. 3. Shallow politics. This is more a commentary on progressivism than on any single progressive idea. Many supporters are driven by emotion and a sense of right and wrong, and I agree with many of the issues they raise. But they often do not go in depth politically. They offer quick, easy, shallow solutions that don't address root causes. The ideal is often treated as the highest standard, and what should or what shouldn't becomes the primary test. This applies even to optics. I was recently arguing about pictures of protesters opposing the current United States government, not because I thought the protesters were wrong, but because of poor optics. Early protests displayed non-American or unfamiliar flags. Some even showed the Palestinian or Mexican flag. I understand the message, but that is low-hanging fruit for the administration. They can hold up a picture and claim those protesters are Islamic jihadists or Mexican cartel members trying to destroy the country. Obviously that wasn't true, but optics are real. Recent protests were smarter and waved the American flag, but some flew it upside down. I understand that signals a nation in distress, but optics still matter. If your audience is Americans, conservatives will seize on that and claim you're unpatriotic. Some defended it by pointing to public figures who have flown a flag upside down, but right now it's easier for opponents to control the narrative, and most Americans won't understand the nuance. Yes, it's unfair. Yes, you want to send a specific message. But there is a time and a place, and there are ways to do it. Sometimes the right message is communicated in the wrong way. Learn from the early civil rights movement. Look at photos of Ruby Bridges or the Little Rock Nine. They held their heads high and dressed impeccably. They suffered then, but it exposed how cruel the segregationists were. Look at the situation of Claudette Colvin and Rosa Parks. There is a reason the movement did not capitalize on Claudette, even though the action succeeded. Was it fair? Absolutely not. But fair doesn't always win. Going high when the other side goes low does not mean letting the low side go unchecked. It means exposing them while showing how you are better, closer to the ideal. Progressives have every right to be upset and emotional. But too many stay at that emotional level instead of using it as fuel for real, substantial, and effective change. Story 44. The emerging trend of presenting segregation and prejudice as empowering or as safe spaces or compensation for historical inequality is troubling. Racism is still racism. Story 45. In Canada, old age security is paid to Canadians aged 65 and older who have lived in Canada as citizens for 20 years. It pays up to $8,700 annually. Once income exceeds $150,000, old age security payments are reduced. Old age security is not funded by contributions. It is paid from general government revenues. Currently, millennials and Generation Z are being squeezed and, according to politicians, are expected to make sacrifices and shoulder the burden of a failing economy. However, for the wealthiest generation in history, we are expected to maintain their old age security, which helps wealthy seniors even more at the expense of a generation unable to buy homes. One can argue that our general pension plan was created when the median lifespan was 71 years, implying about 6 years of payout. Now lifespans are expected to be 82. 5 years, so benefits have improved dramatically for baby boomers. Since government debt has grown out of control and the economy has not kept pace, Generation Z and millennials are likely paying into a pension system from which they will never benefit. This seemingly progressive policy is extremely regressive in the current context. Story 46. Having all ability levels in one classroom, teachers often end up teaching to the middle. Lower performing students understand little, and higher performing students are deprived of a full education. Story 47. Specific examples from my old city. Clean air zones, when poorly implemented, can effectively act as a tax on the working class. The city I used to live in introduced a clean air zone that largely targeted vans, which are how working class tradespeople and small business owners travel. To work in the city now, you either have to upgrade to an electric van, which is unaffordable, or pay the charge. Pedestrianizing neighborhoods can also restrict access for disabled people if done without careful planning, even though the aim is to improve mobility. Story 48. When women exploit other women's sexuality, it is still the exploitation of women. It is just being done by someone else. Story 49. Term limits for politicians often produce 3 related problems in legislatures. There is a constant influx of new legislators who do not know how to govern. These lawmakers become susceptible to lobbyists, and politicians often focus on their next job, whether in another legislative body or with the companies or interest groups that have been lobbying them. A better solution to removing outdated, entrenched, and ineffective officials is to make it easier for voters to replace them through campaign finance reform, public funding of campaigns, and other measures that give challengers an equal footing. Story 50. Recycling is designed more to make us feel better about ourselves than to significantly affect the environment. Yale Climate Connections reports that recycling has minimal impact on the climate. Story 51. Rent control reduces incentives to build apartment buildings, decreasing housing supply and raising rents, which harms low-income households. Story 52. Many forms of urban planning end up promoting segregation and hindering environmental progress. Story 53. Don't ask, don't tell turned out to be that. It was meant to be liberating, and it ended up being used as a tool for harassment and persecution. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.